They were counted, assigned, and confined like prisoners, yet nothing in their daily experience confirmed that role, because fear never arrived, pressure never escalated, and over time the absence of everything they expected began to feel more powerful than force itself, raising a quiet but disturbing question about how a man can remain imprisoned while slowly losing the sensation of being one. From the outside, nothing suggested that their status had changed, because the camp still functioned as a place of confinement, complete with schedules, roll calls, and boundaries that defined where movement began and ended. Yet inside that structure, something less visible had already started to shift, loosening the connection between what they were called and what they felt themselves to be. They continued to follow routine, not because they were reminded of their position, but because routine had become the most efficient way to move through time without drawing attention to themselves. Days unfolded with a quiet consistency that required no resistance and offered no challenge, allowing behavior to settle into patterns that no longer felt imposed. What unsettled them was not restriction, but the absence of reinforcement. No one insisted on reminding them of their status, and no moment arrived that demanded they confront it directly. The role of prisoner existed on paper and in procedure, yet it rarely asserted itself in experience, creating a distance between identity and sensation that grew wider with each uneventful day. They noticed that their own reactions were changing before they could explain why. Movements slowed, not out of fear, but out of familiarity, as though urgency no longer served a purpose in an environment where nothing required immediate response. Posture softened, voices lowered, and the sharp edge of vigilance gradually dulled without any clear signal that it was safe to do so. The camp did not need to convince them of anything. It simply remained consistent, allowing repetition to do the work that intimidation often performs. In this consistency, the meaning of captivity began to blur, not because freedom appeared, but because the sensations associated with imprisonment failed to persist. They still lined up, still waited, still followed instruction, yet these actions no longer carried the emotional weight they once expected. Compliance did not feel like surrender, and waiting did not feel like submission. Both became neutral activities, stripped of significance by their regularity. What replaced the feeling of being held was a sense of suspension, as though life had been placed on pause rather than taken away. Time passed without friction, and the lack of conflict allowed the mind to conserve effort by disengaging from questions that offered no immediate relevance. They did not stop thinking of themselves as prisoners all at once. The change was gradual, occurring through countless small moments when the label failed to align with experience. Each time the expected sensation failed to appear, the role lost a little of its authority, becoming something abstract rather than felt. The environment encouraged this detachment without intention or instruction. Nothing challenged their self-perception, and nothing reinforced it either, leaving identity to drift quietly between definition and absence. In this space, the role of prisoner began to feel theoretical, present in name but distant in practice. As this detachment deepened, effort shifted inward. Instead of preparing for threat or punishment, the mind adapted to maintaining balance within a narrow, predictable world. Attention focused on the immediate and the repeatable, avoiding questions that required emotional investment or long-term consideration. This narrowing did not feel like loss. It felt like adjustment. The men adapted to the environment as it was, not as they had imagined it would be, allowing the present to replace expectation as the primary reference point for behavior. By the end of this phase, the contradiction had become impossible to ignore. They were still prisoners by definition, yet the internal signals that once confirmed that identity had faded, leaving behind a quiet uncertainty about what the role now meant. What they could not yet articulate was that this fading was not accidental. It was the result of an environment that did not need to remind them who they were, because over time, the sensation of being confined had begun to dissolve on its own. That realization remained incomplete, hovering just beyond conscious recognition, as the men continued to live within a role that no longer felt entirely real, unaware that this detachment marked the beginning of a deeper transformation still to come. By the second stretch of days, the camp no longer felt defined by fences or guard towers, because the strangest pressure was not coming from force, but from the way the place behaved like a normal routine that refused to admit it was a cage. The gates might be there, the uniforms might be there, the paperwork might be there, yet the air inside the compound carried a quiet contradiction, as though captivity had been carefully cleaned of its obvious signs, leaving only the expectation that you would remain where you were supposed to remain. It began with small details that looked harmless when taken one at a time, because harmless details rarely announce what they are doing to the mind. The schedules arrived on time. The meals appeared with steady predictability. The head counts happened without shouting, without theatrics, without the kind of cruelty that gives a prisoner a clear enemy to hate. Even the guards, when they spoke, often spoke like men discussing tasks rather than men enforcing punishment, and that tone mattered more than it should have, because it made the entire structure feel less like confinement and more like administration. The prisoners noticed something else, not all at once, but in the way a person notices a clock only after realizing they have been checking it for an hour. Certain doors, especially the practical doors that separated work areas from storage areas, were not always locked. A few interior gates were latched, but not chained. Some evenings, a door would be left standing open as if someone had simply forgotten, and for a moment the camp would look like a place that trusted you, which was exactly what made it dangerous, because trust can be a tool when it is offered in the wrong shape. At first, no one said anything about it, because speaking about an open path turns it into a test, and tests inside camps had a way of changing the temperature of the room. Men would glance, then look away, then glance again, as though their eyes were doing the thinking their mouths refused to do. A few walked closer, not with the desperate energy of escape, but with the cautious curiosity of a person approaching an object that might be booby-trapped, even if it looked like a simple wooden frame and a strip of light. When no alarm came, when no guard rushed forward, when no punishment followed, a new kind of unease arrived because the absence of consequences did not feel like safety. It felt like a message delivered without words. The message was not, "You are free." The message was, "We are watching what you will do when we do not appear to be watching." And that message reached deeper than a locked gate ever could, because it forced a man to police himself while pretending he was making his own choices. Some prisoners tried to explain it logically, which is what people do when their instincts begin to shout. They said the camp was secure enough that a door did not matter. They said the guards were confident, or careless, or both. They said Americans liked procedures, and procedures sometimes included moments of looseness that were still part of the plan. They told each other stories about other camps, other rules, other experiments, because stories can protect a mind from admitting that it is confused. But logic did not remove the feeling that something had shifted, because the open doors created a strange tension, one that did not push men outward, but pressed them inward. If escape was possible, even technically possible, then staying became harder to explain, and once staying becomes hard to explain, a prisoner begins to invent reasons that make him sound rational, even to himself. He tells himself he is waiting for the right moment. He tells himself he is protecting others. He tells himself he is conserving strength. He tells himself he is thinking, but underneath those explanations there is often a quieter truth, which is that the mind is searching for a rule to hold on to, because rule is what makes time tolerable. The camp understood this, whether by design or by habit, and the routine continued without dramatic escalation. There were no speeches about obedience, yet obedience spread anyway. Not because men suddenly respected the guards, but because uncertainty is exhausting, and exhaustion makes a person choose the path that requires the least immediate risk. A locked door is simple because it tells you what reality is. An unlocked door is complicated because it asks you to decide what reality is, and decision in captivity can feel like a trap disguised as agency. One afternoon, during a work detail that moved tools from one shed to another, a prisoner found himself standing near a door that should have been secured. The sun fell across the threshold in a clean, bright line, and beyond it there was only a short stretch of yard, and beyond that another gate, and beyond that the outer world that had not changed simply because he had been placed behind barbed wire. He did not step through. He did not even lean forward. He simply stood there long enough to feel the full weight of the moment settle onto his shoulders, because the moment was not about distance. It was about permission, and permission offered by an enemy does not feel like permission. It feels like a puzzle with teeth. He returned to his task without speaking, and later he told no one exactly what he had felt because he did not have the language for it, and because language would have made it contagious. Yet others had their own versions of the same moment, and by evening you could sense it in the compound like a low-weather front, a quiet pressure that made men more careful with their expressions, more restrained in their conversations, more inclined to wait for someone else to name what they were all noticing. The guard did not need to lock every door anymore, because the camp was slowly teaching the prisoners to lock themselves inside their own assumptions. The fear was not of bullets or dogs or sirens, although those things existed in the background as possibilities. The fear was of stepping into an opportunity and discovering that the opportunity had been placed there to measure you, to label you, to separate you, or to punish you later in a way that would be explained as your own choice. And so, the second phase settled into place, not with violence, but with a calm, deliberate ambiguity that made every open doorway feel less like an exit and more like a question no one dared to answer aloud. After the uncertainty introduced by those open moments, daily life inside the camp began to settle into a shape that no longer felt provisional, because repetition has a way of convincing the mind that what continues must also be correct. The men still noticed the boundaries, still registered the presence of guards and fences, yet these elements slowly receded into the background, no longer demanding the attention they once commanded. Morning routines unfolded with a familiarity that required no reflection. Bodies rose, lined up, moved, and waited in patterns that felt increasingly automatic, as though the camp had trained motion itself to proceed without conscious involvement. The absence of confrontation allowed these patterns to deepen, turning behavior into habit rather than response. What changed most noticeably was not what they did, but how little they questioned it. Actions no longer felt like compliance with an external system, but like participation in an internal rhythm that had developed quietly over time. Waiting ceased to feel like delay and began to feel like the natural state between moments, something that did not need to be justified or challenged. Conversations reflected this shift. Men spoke less about what might happen and more about what had already happened, grounding discussion in the certainty of routine rather than the instability of possibility. Speculation faded, replaced by observation, because observation did not require commitment, while speculation carried the risk of disappointment or exposure. The idea of leaving did not disappear, but lost its sharpness. It existed as a distant concept rather than an active consideration, something acknowledged in passing but rarely engaged with directly. In this way, remaining inside the camp stopped feeling like a decision and began to feel like a continuation, an extension of what had already been happening without consequence. The camp reinforced this normalization without instruction. Nothing explicitly encouraged passivity, yet nothing disrupted it either, allowing familiarity to accumulate until it outweighed curiosity. Each uneventful day confirmed the previous one, strengthening the sense that stability, even within confinement, was preferable to uncertainty beyond it. As behavior aligned more closely with routine, effort shifted away from vigilance. Posture relaxed, movements became less guarded, and the constant internal scanning for threat gradually subsided. This relaxation did not feel earned or celebrated. It simply occurred, unnoticed, because nothing demanded that it stop. The most subtle change occurred in how time was perceived. Days were no longer counted in anticipation of change, but experienced as complete units in themselves. The future felt less like a destination and more like an extension of the present, reducing the emotional pull of alternatives that required disruption. Remaining where they were began to feel normal not because it was pleasant, but because it was predictable. Predictability offered relief from the strain of interpretation, removing the need to evaluate every moment for hidden meaning or risk. In this environment, stillness carried less psychological cost than movement. This adjustment was rarely discussed openly. Acknowledging it would have required admitting that the camp no longer felt like a temporary condition, and such an admission carried implications few were ready to confront. Silence, therefore, became a form of agreement, allowing the shift to continue without resistance. By this stage, the line between captivity and routine had blurred enough that the two were no longer experienced as opposites. The men were still prisoners by definition, but the sensation of being held had softened into something less distinct, something that no longer provoked reaction. What they did not yet realize was that this sense of normality was not neutral. It was the result of a gradual alignment between environment and behavior, one that made staying feel effortless while rendering change increasingly abstract. The third phase completed itself quietly, without announcement, as the camp succeeded in redefining what felt ordinary. Remaining was no longer explained or defended. It simply was. And in that quiet acceptance, the foundation was laid for a deeper shift still waiting to surface. By the time the camp reached what the calendar would have called its middle weeks, the strangest thing was no longer the absence of chains or the lack of a locked gate, because the men had already learned to live inside that contradiction, but the way freedom began to appear in small, carefully placed pieces, as if it were being introduced like a new rule that no one had explained yet. The mornings still arrived in the same order, with the same roll calls, the same paths worn into the dust, and the same routine that never felt brutal enough to be called punishment, yet never felt casual enough to be called ordinary life either. Every day carried the same quiet question. If this was a prison, why did it look so much like a place that expected cooperation rather than surrender? The camp did not shout its power. It practiced it patiently through repetition that felt almost polite. What unsettled the prisoners most was not the presence of guards, but the way the guards seemed to allow space, not enough to forget who controlled the camp, but enough to create confusion about what exactly was being controlled. A gate might stand open during a delivery. A supply shed might be left with its door resting against the frame instead of latched tight. A pathway might be left unblocked for longer than usual. None of these things were dramatic on their own, but together they formed a pattern that felt deliberate, as if someone somewhere was watching to see what the prisoners would do when the camp briefly stopped acting like a cage. And the prisoners did not run. They noticed, of course, because men who have survived capture do not stop noticing details. They noticed the way a guard leaned his weight into one boot and looked away at the wrong time. They noticed a truck parked with its keys too casually placed. They noticed a chain looped through a gate that was not pulled tight, leaving just enough slack to suggest a mistake. These were not invitations written on paper, but they felt like invitations all the same, the kind that carried consequences even if nobody spoke a word. So the men watched one another, and the watching became its own discipline. The camp's strangest pressure was not enforced by violence, but by uncertainty, because uncertainty forces men to manage themselves. If one prisoner moved too quickly toward an open space, another would slow his pace, not through orders, but through the heavy influence of shared fear. Not fear of the guard alone, but fear of what would happen afterward, fear that a single act would reshape the entire environment and turn these odd, soft edges into hard corners overnight. The camp's privileges, if they could be called that, added to the confusion. There were moments of work that resembled employment more than forced labor, tasks that required patience and skill rather than mere obedience. There were meals that were not luxurious, but consistent, and consistency can feel like a trap when a man expects cruelty and instead receives routine. There were afternoons where the camp sounded almost normal, like a place where time passed without catastrophe, and that normality was itself unsettling, because it made the prisoners question their own instincts. A man can resist brutality with anger, but how does he resist comfort that feels conditional, comfort that seems designed to soften the sharp identity of prisoner until it becomes difficult to locate inside oneself? That was the heart of it. The camp did not simply hold bodies, it pressed gently against identity. The men began to feel as if the word prisoner no longer fit cleanly, and yet nothing else fit either. They were not guests. They were not workers. They were not free. They were something in between, and the in between is where the mind begins to fray, because it cannot settle into a single story. The quiet contradictions started to alter their decisions in ways they barely understood. Some men became careful to follow rules that had never been stated, as though the camp had taught them to obey invisible lines. Others became uneasy around opportunities, because opportunity inside a prison does not feel like generosity, it feels like bait. Even simple choices like where to stand during a break or how long to linger near a doorway began to carry a weight that felt out of proportion, as if every small movement might be interpreted as proof of something. And then there was the most disturbing part, the part they did not speak about even to themselves. The faint feeling that leaving might be possible, but returning to the world outside might no longer be simple. Not because they had grown to love the camp, but because the camp had become a system they understood. It was limited, controlled, predictable in its own strange way. Outside the fence was uncertainty of a different kind, the uncertainty of being hunted, the uncertainty of surviving alone, the uncertainty of not knowing what had changed back home, the uncertainty of whether escape would lead to freedom or simply to another kind of capture. So when the gate stood open, the men did what they had learned to do. They waited. They watched. They measured the air for hidden consequences. They stayed within the boundaries that were no longer only physical, but psychological, boundaries reinforced by a quiet, steady pressure that required no shouting at all. In that way, the camp achieved something more powerful than locks. It made freedom feel dangerous. It made restraint feel intelligent. It made staying feel like the only decision that could be justified, even when no one was forcing them. And the longer this continued, the more the prisoners began to fear a different possibility, one that settled like cold dust in the back of the mind, that the camp's true purpose was not to keep them from leaving, but to teach them how to choose not to leave on their own. After enough days had passed without consequence, the camp no longer felt like a place where decisions waited to be made, but like a system that quietly rewarded stillness by allowing it to continue uninterrupted. Nothing announced this shift because systems that rely on habit do not need ceremonies. They simply repeat themselves until repetition begins to feel like reason. The men still recognized the boundaries, yet those boundaries no longer demanded attention. Fences existed, towers remained occupied, and rules were followed, but the emotional charge that once accompanied these markers had faded. They were no longer signals of danger or defiance, but fixtures in a landscape that had become familiar enough to stop provoking reaction. What had once felt like caution slowly transformed into preference. Staying inside the known rhythm of the camp reduced uncertainty, minimized risk, and required no explanation. Each day that passed without incident reinforced the quiet lesson that nothing was gained by testing limits, while everything that mattered could be preserved by maintaining balance. Behavior adapted accordingly. Men learned where to stand, when to speak, and how to move without drawing notice, not because they were instructed to do so, but because these patterns worked. The camp did not punish deviation often, yet the possibility of disruption became enough to discourage it. Order no longer needed enforcement. It sustained itself through expectation. Over time, the act of choosing itself began to feel unnecessary. Decisions imply alternatives, and alternatives require energy, imagination, and risk. In an environment where routine delivered stability and deviation offered only uncertainty, the mind gradually abandoned the effort of comparison. Remaining was no longer a decision. It was simply the continuation of what had already proven safe. This adjustment did not feel like surrender. It felt like intelligence. The men told themselves they were being careful, patient, disciplined. They believed they were preserving strength for a future moment that would require it. Yet that future moment remained undefined, drifting further away as each day resolved itself without demanding change. The most unsettling aspect of this transformation was how natural it felt. There was no internal resistance, no moment of alarm signaling that something essential was being lost. The absence of struggle made the condition feel complete, as though the camp had achieved equilibrium. And equilibrium rarely invites challenge. As routine solidified, identity followed. The label of prisoner still existed, but no longer shaped behavior in the same way. The men acted less in response to what they were and more in alignment with where they were. The camp became the primary reference point, quietly replacing the world beyond it as the framework within which decisions were understood. Time passed without punctuation. Days no longer marked progress toward anything, but resolved themselves fully as they occurred. Anticipation weakened, not because hope was crushed, but because hope required contrast, and contrast had been smoothed away by consistency. In this state, even the idea of leaving felt distant, not forbidden but abstract. It belonged to another version of reality, one that no longer pressed against daily life with urgency. Staying required no courage and no explanation. Leaving would have required disruption, justification, and the willingness to step into uncertainty without guidance. The camp did not need to convince the men to remain. It allowed them to convince themselves. By offering a structure that felt predictable and contained, it transformed restraint into habit and habit into preference. Control no longer needed to be applied from the outside because it had been absorbed quietly into behavior. By the time this pattern fully settled, the process was complete. Not choosing had become the most comfortable state. Waiting had become the safest action. Remaining had become indistinguishable from deciding to remain. And in that quiet resolution, the men found themselves held not by locks or threats, but by the powerful human instinct to protect stability once it has been established, even when that stability exists behind wire. Nothing announced the end of this process, because nothing dramatic was required for it to be complete. The camp remained as it had been, The routines continued, and the absence of pressure persisted without drawing attention to itself. What mattered was not what the prisoners had lost, but what they had slowly stopped reaching for. Choice still existed, yet it no longer asked to be used. Movement was possible, yet possibility alone no longer carried urgency. Over time, remaining required no decision, while leaving demanded an explanation the mind no longer felt compelled to provide. Stability had replaced resistance, and habit had quietly taken the place of force. The most unsettling truth was not that freedom was denied, but that it faded from awareness once it stopped feeling necessary. And that leaves a question that extends beyond this place, asking how often confinement succeeds not by closing doors, but by teaching the mind that staying feels safer than stepping away. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.